Carter McNabb, he's one of the founding partners of GRA. GRA, one of the key sponsors here for our conference, being one of the specialist supply chain organisations in this part of the world for some number of years, and certainly one of the premium consulting organisations of making practical, real step change supply chain improvement. And Carter himself has many years' experience in international supply chain advisory and transformational experience, both in the education side but also on the practical side. Been at it for a long time. I've known Carter for a while as well, and couldn't think of a better guy to talk to us today in our stream about addressing the capability gap affecting industry competitiveness. Carter, welcome.
Ingleby, thanks very much for that introduction. That was very kind. Also wanted to say thanks to Accolade for bringing us all together today, and to thank each of you for your interest and your choice to be here, because lots of things we could have all done today, yet we're here. So thanks for sharing this space. Just a little bit of background on where this presentation came from. We have a partnership with an organisation called the Australian Food and Grocery Council. Some of you may be aware of it, some may not. It's called the AFGC. It's a Canberra-based organisation that represents all the suppliers into the major major grocery retailers. And what it does is it looks at capability and practices and so on to help respond to some of the demands of that market. We have a relationship with the Supply Chain Committee, and we do an annual survey that looks at trends in that industry and also some of the challenges and opportunities. We did that recently, and two key things came out of it. One was that 89% of the respondents of the survey said that they had a formal s&OP process in place. So there was one. That was really good. And I suppose if we think about the FMC industry, it makes sense because a lot of that's still manufacturing based. So again, there are a lot of constraints and capacities and pressures that have to be managed. So the conditions that require that sort of a process are evident in that industry. So that wasn't a surprise in and of itself. What was interesting though is that 60% of the respondents said that their scenario planning capability was either insufficient or non-existent. And so what we've seen then is an investment in s&OP and the sorts of systems to support it, yet we're still not necessarily getting all the results that we want in terms of being able to respond and adapt to impacts and changes. So in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about what scenario planning is and what the benefits are. And before we jump into that, I just want to talk about some of the conditions that we think are creating more of a need for scenario planning. So scenario planning at a high level is the ability to have an understanding of what's going to happen in the future. So it's creating certainty out of uncertainty, and then being able to act with confidence on that information so we can navigate that. And as I said, there are a few things that I think are increasing the need for it. So I'll talk about two big picture trends and then drill into a couple of ones that are happening in the industry. Again, this was largely for the food and grocery membership bodies, so fast-moving consumer goods. Having said that, I suspect that most of you will find a lot of the messaging in this quite relevant. So first, big picture change. So I pulled this out of a National Geographic a few years ago, and what that diagram shows on the left-hand side is what the global population was estimated in 1 AD. 200 million people. Okay, so at the height of the Roman Empire, there was about 200 million people, on estimates. Then move forward about 1,800 years to 1800, we're at about 1 billion people. 100 years later, we're at another billion. Hold on. What kind of took 1,800 years just took 100 years. So think about the technological, industrial, and medical advancements that precipitated that level of growth. And then what you see here on the right-hand side is these kind of step changes by 1 billion through the 1900s. And what I think is notable, the most recent decade saw another 1 billion increase. So it once took 1,800 years and then took 100 years, just took 10 years. Okay, and then the expectation is that's going to level off by about 9 billion in 2045. That's what the projections are. So my first question is, when you look at that graph, how do you feel? Yeah, me too. There's a mixture of excitement and some fear in that, which in my opinion is healthy. Means a couple things. It means, the challenge we have globally and corporately to optimally manage resources and assets becomes more important. I think there's a responsibility in that. From a business perspective, it means we operate in a much more complex, much more diverse, much larger scale environment. And the infrastructure requirements to support that are becoming more extreme. So that in itself creates lots of change. Lots of things are happening, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. This is something we have to be able to adapt to. On top of, we call that big population, and you've heard this a lot, big data. This was another article from National Geographic. And what it was looking at is the trail of data that we leave as we go about our day-to-day lives. So in other words, as we browse on the internet, send text messages and so on. This diagram, these thought bubbles, represent predictions that MIT labs can make with a very high degree of accuracy just by looking at browsing data. So one of them was, for example, based on social circle, likely to repay a loan. So who might be interested in that information? Banks, yeah, insurance companies and so on, right. So if I get turned down for a loan and I don't know why, so there's some ethical questions around that, but that's real. Another one just applied for a 7th credit card. Interesting as well. One that tends to get the biggest shock result, and you know, tends to be a little controversial, but is this one kind of down the middle. It says pregnant but doesn't know it yet. So purely based on search behavior, MIT labs can identify if someone's pregnant before that person actually knows it. Yeah, so there's biological changes, endocrine system, which impacts the nervous system, which impacts behavior and so on. So that can be picked up. So there's a lot more of us running around. There's a whole lot of data that's being created. And so one of the critical success factors is turning that sea of data into some usable information. So again, so we can make decisions to optimally use our resources and our assets. Okay? So if I kind of think about this more from an evolutionary perspective, evolution is driven by adaptation to change. And again, there's a lot of change happening on the global stage in terms of population increase and this new way of being in terms of data visibility or data quantity. So a critical success factor then becomes the ability to learn and to implement quickly. It's what I call the awareness to understanding to action cycle. So awareness being, how do I know what I need to know? What's important? There's a lot of data, so what's important to know? Once I figure that out, how do I learn what to do with that data? You know, to make sense of it, to get some understanding from it. And the third thing is, once I then know that, how do I actually put that into action? And I think Mark's presentation before touched on those points quite well. All right. So we've touched on a couple of these big picture trends. So people population and data population. I'm now going to just go into a couple of industry trends that further highlight the need for this. So these are conditions that we're seeing in industry. So this was what we heard from the AFGC survey, which again, I don't think will come as any surprise to those in the room. One theme was there's margin pressure, so input costs continue to rise without the ability to commensurately increase a selling price, okay? Secondly, there's increasing customer expectations. And if I look at what I would call a standard service to cost curve, you know, the general idea being that as I increase my service, my cost goes up. So all things being equal, what happens if just my cost goes up? Well, unless I do something differently, by definition, my service is going to have to decrease in some way, which doesn't tend to be a very popular response in the market. So that doesn't really work for us. So we have to do things differently to address that. So again, we're operating in a much more complex environment, a lot more data, costs are going up, and at the same time, customer expectations are increasing. So what are we doing? And again, the survey generated some interesting points. One was that 89% of these businesses had a formal s&OP process in place. So what that said to us is there's recognition that there's a need to create frameworks to be able to answer those trade-off questions and decisions and to try to come up with a way of planning the business on an integrated basis. So that was the first thing. Then what we heard is that there wasn't as strong as an ability to plan, so we don't have the scenario planning capability. And then if we drilled into it a bit further, where you see some of the red X's, these are around things like, do we have the right levels of ownership in the business? So do we have organizational maturity that allows something like s&OP to work well, okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but at the end of the day, we really need to understand what are the organizational contexts that allow something like this to come to life. So there were some issues around accountability, there were some issues around integration of the information across the business, and also with involving the overall supply chain, such as suppliers and customers. So again, great level of recognition, but still not seeing the results just yet. Okay. So what adaptive capability do we need as an industry to respond to that? Scenario planning. I know you didn't see it coming. It was. But what is it? Just at a really high level, the way I would define scenario planning is by some characteristics. It's the ability to turn the known into the unknown. It's ability to assess options optimally and factually, and then the ability to act with confidence. Okay. And I'm just going to call this now. Once we did the survey, the AFGC came back to us and said, it looks like there's a capability gap in industry. Can you guys talk about this and explore it? We said, sure. And I was sort of thinking about it, and I was like, this sounds an awful lot like s&OP in a way. And I'd argue it is. It's what I'd say it's another stage of the evolution of s&OP, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I think what's exciting, though, is this isn't a notional way of doing things. We've actually seen this in industry, and I'll give you a case study on that, what that looks like, with the permission of the company that we've seen it in. To talk a little bit about scenario planning, scenario planning is a capability and a process. So it's the ability to answer certain questions, and again, it's the process in the organization that gives us the clarity for what to do when something happens. So if a series of conditions manifest, we actually have an organized, orderly way of getting something done. It's not just a capability. Like I often say, you can give me a really nice power tool, and I'll stick it in my shed because I don't really know how to use it very well. Like I don't have the maturity to use it, nor do I buy it just because it's a cool thing. So what we're saying is we have to have that context in which for this to really have strong foundations. So from a strategic planning perspective, this is looking out more in the long term, and these are answering questions such as what sort of supply chain network or infrastructure do I need to remain cost optimal and provide the service, noting how things are changing. So if cost structures are changing, capacities are changing, we're trying to activate new markets and new channels, we're bringing new products, we're taking some out, we're looking at a merger and acquisition, et cetera. The ability to understand what that looks like is really important. There's also scenario planning in the more operational horizon, which has kind of traditionally been where s&OP lives, and I know there's been designs to expand that, and we'll talk about that. But that's around the demand shaping, our inventory planning, our production planning, our capacity planning. And then we even get into scenario planning in the tactical horizon. So sometimes this is around, production scheduling. It might be around inventory redistribution. It might be around transportation planning. The point is, the areas that are important to you depend on the value levers in your business. So not all things are created equal, and it really, again, this is all about having the knowledge of what actually drives value in your business in terms of making decisions, which is a key theme we'll come back to in the case study. And the idea is that this can overlay on our s&OP processes, because you're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's sort of the triangle that says, as long as I'm not naked, hungry, and cold, I can sort of worry about the sort of person I'd really like to be, right? But if I'm naked, hungry, and cold, I'm kind of more worried about that right now than, am I meeting my life's purpose? I just want to eat. Make sense? So the point is that as we build layers of capability and foundations, if those foundations are strong, we can build other things on top. It's also the way I look at, if I see an airplane flying in the sky, in some ways I see an airplane flying. On the other hand, I see a symbol of a society that has enough integrated systems and maturity to make that possible. It's in some ways what I kind of think, if you go back to the Austrian Empire or the Prussians, when they had classical music playing in the court, that might have been a symbol of a higher stage of evolution, because it's hard to make classical music when we're beating each other with sticks, right? So similar kind of idea, in the sense that we can build some scenario planning on top of some strong structures. So where, and again, I'm taking some shortcuts in this description, but where s&OP sometimes starts as simple demand and supply balancing, and then evolves into something that we're notionally doing at an organizational level, making organizational level trade-offs and doing that based on profitability, not just financial or volume, but both. That's where that comes. And I also want to say that scenario planning will start to appear in different places, because if we're doing demand and supply balancing well and effectively, we should be able to get a sense for what if we change our forecast, what happens over here. So it's not like it just flicks on overnight, but the capability is built. The other thing I'd say on this is that even though that kind of looks like the highest step on the ladder, what happens is at some point, in our view, is that's going to become an expected capability. So right now, it's kind of the aspirational capability becomes the one that we have to stay competitive. And that's why I'm also excited to share this case study with you, to show you what an organization that does this sort of stuff looks like. All right, so what do some of those foundations look like? So what are the foundations required to support it? I won't talk to this whole thing. This is something that we call the Supply Chain Excellence Framework, and really, I guess, breaks this framework down into the strategic, operational, and tactical horizons. And what we're really saying here, in some ways, the middle section kind of becomes this piece that links the business strategy to the operations and allows us to answer these questions. To make that effective, for example, the business strategy needs to be operationally defined. So in other words, to become the market leader in X, good. To operationally define that so there's targets around it, better. Customer value proposition. So we heard in the last presentation how TradeLink had created a new customer value proposition. I guess it's not uncommon to walk into a business and there to be a way that the customers are serviced, often informal, often based on the most powerful customers. To some extent, I shouldn't say dictating, but getting more of the share of the business's attention and time. And is that good or bad? I'm not judging it. What I've seen work well is putting in place a very clear customer service policy. These are A, B, and C customers or products, whatever that might look like. This is what each of those get in a priority trade-off situation. This is what we do. So it creates clarity in the organization as opposed to assumption or who can hold the most influence by virtue of working the people networks. It's just a different way of doing it. Again, provides clarity. With an enunciated business strategy and a customer value proposition, then it gives us a bit more clarity to set up our supply chain, what the footprint looks like, what the operating model looks like, and so on. What we also need in this kind of cultural level, the organizational level, are things like an organizational structure that has accountability linked to influence. Have you seen situations where you might have a supply planner who is responsible for dated and damaged inventory but has no say in the forecast? And that's hard, because I care about this, I'm getting measured on it, but I don't seem to really be able to control it. Conversely, you might see sales teams that have incentives based on gross margin, and sometimes it's more difficult to engage the sales team in a conversation about cost control or stock reduction because it doesn't really impact what they do. So their view is, we'll just crank up the forecast a bit more, so that'll make sure I get the stock, and that's more important to me than something else. So making sure that the ownership and the KPIs, there's some alignment around that really helps. Another thing that really helps are policies. So a not uncommon conversation we hear is the management team saying, this situation came up, we don't know why the team made this decision. And then the team making the decision says, this situation comes up all the time, yet we have no clarity from management what they want us to do. So everyone's well intended, it's just, how do we actually be clear on what those policies are? So the policy might be a short of supply situation. Are there some firm rules that we can have? Or past a certain point, is there a process that gets invoked? It might be on introducing a new product. We have some policies on how we do that, and also on, say, running a product out. So I could go on about that for a while, but formalization of those policies becomes really important. And then below that is the people, process, and systems capability that we've already heard a lot about today. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I guess what I'm saying is there has to be reasonable capability, reasonable goodness in all of those areas, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. But it's a way we sometimes look at a whole business to say, do all the Christmas lights light up, or are we missing a few over here? Because if we're missing a few big ones, that sometimes makes it more challenging to get change to stick. Okay, so what can we do with scenario planning? So again, scenario planning is something that turns the unknown into the known, and then it allows us to act with confidence. So on the right-hand side here, what this graph is in simplest form, the red line shows the service level, and the bars are the amount of cost that are required to achieve that service level. So again, we heard about this in the last presentation. In the main, we don't see this as a capability industry as much as we'd like to. I think that would be helpful for industry if it's competitive, is to actually factually understand its service and cost curve. So in the first instance, what we did is said, this is the relationship between your cost and service level. And if you look at the bars down there, what the descriptions are, what those just show are some different options in the supply chain. So in other words, here are things that we could do to get that result. Okay, so it's based on factually looking at the options, seeing what the benefits are. Then what the business can do is say, we can see those options and we know how difficult, we know what level of risk is involved, what kind of change management's involved. So what's the bang for buck? What should we approach? So again, it turns an unknown into a known, and then allows us to look at our options and act with confidence. Now that graph showed both a service going up with cost going down, and again, when we're able to make optimal decisions with fact-based information at a reasonable level of detail aggregated up, we tend to get top line and bottom line improvements. So from a top line improvement, there's revenue realization, because we're actually capturing opportunities and sometimes winning the right to get more opportunities. From a cash flow perspective, we're running our fixed assets and our current assets better, so more efficiently, so generating more cash flow, and those ratios are lower. And because we're planning to do something in the main more than reacting to something we didn't see, our costs tend to be a lot lower as well. So what we get is a multiplier effect on financial ratios like return on capital employed. We also see these as pretty big return on investment propositions because the opportunity already exists in the business. We don't have to close warehouses necessarily. We don't have to win new customers. We don't have to do a lot of the structural stuff. Sometimes this is just about making better decisions with what exists to get these sorts of results. So it can be a quick win. All right, so I've talked a bit about it at a hypothetical level. I'd like to share with you a case study now. This is with Simplot, Australia. I also want to thank Simplot for allowing us to do this. So they helped us prepare and vet the case study. And my understanding is there are a couple of members of the team from Simplot here today. And they may or may not be willing to talk about this after the fact. Okay, so what I'll do is let's talk about first the conditions. So as I said before, so we anything that we do generally is motivated by a want or a need. And so if I've got more stringent pressures and constraints, that'll give me more of a reason to do something. And so in some ways, the characteristics of Simplot business, I think, made this more relevant to it earlier on in the piece. And what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, its value proposition in some of its key categories is Australian grown. Okay, so this is food product. So if we don't have it in Australia, then there really aren't options to get it for somewhere else because it's not Australian grown. So there's a constraint there. Second point is it's a food product. So we've got seasonal variation, changes in yield, weather patterns, differences in the harvest seasons, and so on. There's also a question around immediacy. So if, for example, potatoes are harvested, if they're processed at harvest, the yield tends to be more like 80 or 90%. If I defer that decision, it's more like 60%. The business services the major grocery retailers, but also has high priority QSR, quick service restaurant customers like McDonald's. And as a way of their process of contracting with their growers, they provide a forecast out for 2 years. So in other words, so think about that. They've got to have what they would consider an accurate forecast 2 years out to allow them to manage all of those constraints in the supply chain. How do they do that? Well, one is they've had a very disciplined s&OP process in place for 15 years. And I guess probably one of the best examples we've seen in Australia of a high-functioning, well-disciplined, evolved s&OP process. So that's been there for 15 years. It's very clear what the roles and responsibilities are. It's clear what the consequences are if the process isn't followed, and the whole business lives it. So it's, and you can feel it being in the place. They also have supply chain SMEs, so subject matter experts. So if there's an issue that needs to be addressed, there are portions or parts within the business that can answer that from a very informed perspective, so we know where to go to. They also have sophisticated systems where they count. So they've got a tier 1 ERP system, they've got a tier 1 optimization planning system, and they have spreadsheets as well. And those are all pretty well tuned to the parts of the business that need them. So I think that's one of the tricks, is they seem to have a very strong understanding of what system capability is needed where in the business. So it's a very business knowledge focused or led process, as opposed to just we want one system and put everything in it. Okay? That's important. Another one is data. They have granular data, their costs are well understood, and they also understand that not all data is going to be accurate. So the trick is knowing which parts of the data need to be accurate to be able to support the process, and that gets the priority. So again, there's a lot of understanding and knowledge in that, I think, which is great. So a few other things. The plan is the plan. The whole thing is forecast driven. If it's not in the forecast, it's not in the plan. It's that simple. They then look at risks and opportunities against the plan. So if we're not going to meet the plan, or if there's something creating a risk, what are we going to do about that? And if an opportunity comes in, can we respond to it? What does that mean? So that's how it runs. I just want to point out that it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't magically solve problems. But what it does is and the business still experiences impacts. The difference is they can see them coming, and they can make informed decisions about what to do. And that's one of the key differences. And I guess I could talk a bit more about the benefits, but I think the best benefit that I heard in talking to Danny at Simplot about this is he said that the business was approached by one of the major grocery retailers with an opportunity to take on a frozen contract, and it was their ability to come back and confidently say what they could supply by when to an agreed level of service at what capacity, and to do it confidently and put some support and promise around that allowed them to pick it up. And that actually locked out the competition. So it is a competitive competency. Now in all this, I've talked a bit more about the process. There's also a real opportunity in all this is to feed in bottom-up integrated planning data into the process. And that's one of the issues that we sometimes see is there's a disconnect between the higher level data and the lower level data, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. So one of the things that we worked with Simplot on was actually bringing the forecast level down to a lower level, so more down to a site by customer level, and at the same time linking the amount of variability in those forecasts to the safety stock. So now, and again, similar to the last presentation, we heard some information around that, is giving the business the ability to say, if we want to achieve a category level service level, that can blow right down to every stock code in every location, and it becomes something that it's a known, and we can plan to it. It may sound technical, although it makes a big difference in terms of service and cost and inventory results. And so there's some figures on there about what that was worth to them in and of itself, and they're still working towards that at the moment in terms of getting the systems realigned and making progress, which is exciting. All right, so how it's done? I'd say the thing that we're looking for here is still one version of the truth. I mean, I know that's been the calling card of s&OP for a long time, and it's still the calling card as far as I'm concerned. We need to have one version of the truth that we trust, that we're confident in. To create that, we have to have two things. We have to have the right cultural elements, and we have to have reliable information coming into that. So in terms of the cultural elements, just over here on the left, the first thing is commitment. So the business has to be committed to the process at all levels. The second thing is we have to have clarity, roles and responsibilities, ownership and accountability, inputs and outputs, timings and so on. That needs to be known. We then need to have the discipline, which is then around accountability and the follow-up. And the whole thing has to be underpinned by trust. I've put up, I don't know if some of you may have heard of Brené Brown. She's an American, I suppose you'd call her a sociologist. She's done some work into trying to break down, say, the components of trust. So when someone says, I trust you or don't trust you, what does that actually mean? And she's broken that down. I won't go into the detailed version of that now, although I highly recommend seeking out the video. You can find that on YouTube. But trust being very important, and trust in the context of this discussion would be trust that the information I'm looking at is trustable. I believe this, and I'm going to do something. I can act with confidence. The second thing I need to trust is that people have the capabilities they need to have and will take ownership. And the third thing I need for trust is that I have to believe I can speak the truth, and that's okay. Definitely been in businesses where we've heard, well, I won't do that again. I went in and talked about how we weren't, the sales forecast didn't align with the budget, and boy, that didn't go down well. So again, if there's not an environment where I can speak the truth and that be heard and responded to, then again, that's a very big limiting factor for anything real happening there. It's really important. Second thing being, so we talked about the right culture. The second thing being around the reliable information. And again, to make a long story short on this is making sure that we have integrated end-to-end bottom-up planning data that supports the process. And I'll just give a really quick example, which looks something like this. So on the top left, what that says is, imagine we have a product in a location, perhaps it's in the store. A change in the store forecast should create a change in inventory balance, which should create a change to store replenishment, which should create a change to inventory investment, which should create a change to our DC purchasing, which should create a change to our projected on hand. Fair enough. I guess our experience, though, is that process still isn't as integrated as it could be. So where we want this to be, for example, is up at a category level, we could say, what if we do a promotion at 20%? That 20% uplift should blow down to all the store forecasts, and then we automatically get a picture of what that looks like. And that is possible. It's doable. And with that, we get a single version of the truth, because there's not three different departments necessarily having to pull together information different ways and saying why I think this is it, because we've got a systemic way of dealing with this. And this is easily said. It's harder to do for a number of reasons. But in the face of that kind of complexity, what we tend to do is sometimes simplify or use assumptions, and that simplification is where we get some disconnects in our SOP process. So if we look at some of the key meetings in the SOP process and what sort of informational support we might require in executive SOP, what we'd like to have is the ability to make those trade-offs and cost curves, to do that factually. In absence of that, what we sometimes do is use things like days cover policies and rules, which notionally represent a balance between cost and service, but are inflexible. In other words, they don't really take into account those factors, and over time can shift and drift, and we inherit results versus proactively attain them. In terms of demand planning, what we'd like to see is forecasts being done at the lowest level and then being rolled up and then rolled back down, and that maintains the integrity of trends and what's happening at that level. Just one example of why this is important. One of our clients had explained to their sales team that if they improved forecast accuracy, the amount of excess stock would go down and service levels would go up, because we'd have a more accurate forecast, we could position the stock more accurately, and so on. So the sales team did that, and the forecast became more accurate, and nothing happened. So the sales team said, this doesn't work. Don't believe you, sorry, not going to do it anymore. So we had a look at that and kind of looked at one of the system settings, and probably it's worth mentioning that the sales team managed the forecast on a national level. So a product at a national level, even though it was stocked in multiple locations, that's fine. But what happened is once they made the adjustment, the system had to say, now how do I allocate that forecast back to the sites? And in looking at the algorithm, it was basically this. It said, we'll look at the percentage of the total demand that each site had over the last 3 months and proportion it. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. In one site, we start at 0 and we go to 10,000 units. In another site, we start at 10,000 and go to 0. So they both have 50% of the demand. So I'm going to give them both the same amount of forecast. Yeah, one's going through the roof and one's just actually smashed into the ground, right? And so it wasn't that the forecast accuracy improvements weren't working. It was that some of the basic rules that we're using to kind of take the data to the next step, we're taking all the value out of it. And that's reasonably common. So there's often these little settings in the back of these systems that do things like this, that we have these beautiful forecasts and they use like average monthly demand. You kind of see it on a formula somewhere and you go, ooh, That usually kind of tings a bell for me. And the same thing on the supply side is that if we have forward visibility of what's required, that's really helpful. Often though what we have is things like min-max, reorder points, set points that kind of say, if I get below a certain stock level, then I replenish. So the point is it doesn't give me any forward visibility, and that can be an issue too. So what I need is the ability to make simulations and trade-offs. I need the ability to take my high-level projections, blow it down to a lower level and back up. And the third thing I need to do is then understand exactly what that means for my inventory balancing capacities into the future. So just in summary, what I'd say about scenario planning is it's real, it exists, we're seeing it, and we're seeing some really good examples. I think it's going to be something that's going to become more and more important moving forward. Will be a point of competitive difference in the organizations that we see doing it. It already is, and it requires the appropriate cultural context and informational context to enable it. So just as a little thought experiment in parting, so imagine that following this presentation, you get a call from the leader of the business, and they say, look, we've just got a new customer that's come online. They want to increase our volumes by 40% within the lead time gap, by the way. And if we do this, we'll actually win them for the next at least 5 years. Great uplift for the business. So what I need you to do is, can we supply them 40% more volume within our current lead times? Give me my options. What are the yeses and nos? If we do it, how's that going to impact our current customer and supply chain? What are the costs, and what is it going to mean capacity and cost-wise into the future? Go. And if the response is, I was really enjoying this conference and it's a bummer, but I know how to do that and I'm pretty cool with that, that gives you a pretty good sense of maybe where your, those foundations are. And if you're sitting there going, the adrenaline's going, that might give you a different indication of where that capability is in the business today. Thanks very much.